If you have ever struggled with Jira workflows, this is going to be the video for you. So what is a workflow in the first place? So a workflow is just a group of statuses that defines how a task moves from start to finish. And a very basic example of that is going to be a workflow that contains the statuses of to do, in progress, and done. To do is representing something that still needs to be completed. In progress is something that is currently being worked on. And done is a task that has already been completed. Obviously, at a very basic level, it's pretty much just a group of statuses. So let's go over how to create a status in Jira or how to modify an existing one, then getting that applied to an existing project. And we'll also go over some more advanced features like approvals, validators, conditions, and more. So jumping in here, there are going to be two primary places that we can actually find our workflows. The first place is going to be on a project level. So I'll go ahead and open up a sample project here. And in the project settings on the bottom left, we're going to have a tab for workflows. If you're making some modifications to an existing workflow, this is going to be the quickest and easiest way to find them. So in here, you can see that we have our software simplified workflow for project TS. And it's also using the TS software simplified workflow scheme. So the second place that we could go to create and find workflows is going to be on the top right. When we click on settings, we click on issues, and then on the left side, we're going to have a tab for workflows. And this is going to show us all of our workflows across all of Jira, across every single project. And just as an example, I could search for the workflow that we just saw in the other project. If I paste it into the search box with the exact naming convention, you'll see that it shows up here in the test scrum project. We can click on the three dots on the right side and also edit it from this view. Oftentimes I like to copy a workflow when I'm making any kind of major modifications. And when I go to copy a workflow, I'll go ahead and just rename it something. In most cases, I'll just do a 2.0 version. So I'll delete the copy of and then add 2.0 or sometimes 2.1 or 2.5, depending on how major the changes are. This also helps me to revert back to an old workflow if there's something major that broke in the process of creating the new one. If you want to modify an existing workflow, I'd go to the project settings, make sure I grab the correct name, copy it over, and start making my modifications. If we're creating a new workflow, I'll go to the Add Workflows button on the top right and click Create New. There's also some templates from the marketplace. Some of these do tend to be okay. Most of them are not great, so I would kind of stay away from those as of today. I haven't seen many great implementations of these workflows for most processes. So I'll go ahead and create it from scratch. I'll give this workflow a name. Click Create. And now we have our new workflow for test workflow 1. And I'll open up my diagram view since that's a lot easier to work with. And as of right now, it is completely blank with just an open status. To add a new status, all we need to do is click Add Status. And then we could either search for an existing status or add a new one if it doesn't yet exist. So I'll go ahead and search for In Progress. Looks like we already have that. I'm going to allow all statuses to transition into this one. We wouldn't have to deal with any complex workflows for the time being. This also gives us the most flexibility right out of the box. We could always define the specific workflow transitions a little bit later. I'll go ahead and add one more for done. And same thing, I'll allow all statuses to transition into this one. And I'll go ahead and apply that same logic for open since it wasn't applied by default. And there we go. We've built our very first, very simple workflow. So how do we actually get these applied to a project? The first thing to do is to copy the name of this workflow. That way we have it saved for later. I'll go ahead and just highlight and copy this test workflow 1. And now I'll go to an existing project, back to my test Kanban project. I'll go back to my project settings. And now we have an option on this page to add a new workflow. So I'll click the Add Workflow button. I'll add an existing one since it is one that we just built. And I could hit Command F or Control F if you're on Windows. And then I'll paste in my search. This is typically the quickest way to find a workflow since there is a list of quite a bit of them. And then I'll find the workflow that I recently created and I'll hit Next. And we'll select which issue types we want this to apply to. If you want it applied across all issue types, you could just select the checkbox at the top. In this case, I'll only apply it to tasks since I might want to segment which issue types have which workflow attached to them. So I'll select tasks and click Finish. All right, so now it's applied, but not yet published. A word of caution here, speaking from personal experience, if you apply this to an existing project, there is a tendency to break things when you change different workflows, when creating new statuses, or especially when you're deleting statuses from the workflow. So when you go to publish this, you're going to be asked to move any existing statuses that may have been removed or renamed to be migrated to the new ones that we just applied. So I'll go ahead and hit publish, and we'll see if that's going to be the case here. Okay, so we have one task here, and we have a status for backlog and selected for development. In this case, open makes sense for the both of these. If there was something more in progress or more related to done, I would select those as the statuses that it's going to be migrating into. And once I have all of my transitions defined, I'll click on associate. Now our workflow is officially published. I'll go ahead and hit acknowledge. And let's go back to the workflow screen. And as you can see here, there is the original workflow that we had here with all of these issue types and the new one that we just added with the single task issue type that we decided to segment. You can take a quick peek at these by clicking on the diagram button to see exactly which workflows applied and some of the differences between them. All right, so now we've created a workflow and we've applied them to a project. Let's go over some of the more advanced things like status transitions, approvals, and validators. This is going to be where Jira workflows really shine. We have a lot of options for complex or multiple levels of approvals, to add validators and conditions, which essentially require a field or a certain action to be done prior to a transition happening, and post functions, which is essentially an automation that runs after a status transition occurs. Let's go over status transitions since that's going to be the most common thing that we see across our workflows. So I'll find my test workflow and click edit. And in here, rather than having all transitions, I'll go ahead and remove allow all status transitions, just so we could set these up to be a little bit more manual and customized. All we need to do now is to hover over an existing status, grab one of the points. So I'll go from open to in progress, hover over a point and drop. Now I'm going to be asked to give the transition a name. I'll give it a name of start work. So this is going to be pretty common when you're making any kind of major changes or removing statuses from workflows. We actually need to copy the workflow and then replace it after we've made our changes rather than making changes inside of a live environment. So I'll click cancel, and what we're going to do is copy over this test workflows one. We'll go to our settings on the top right, click on issues. We'll go back to our global workflows here and search for our test workflow one, which is currently active. And we'll go ahead and run through the same process we did before of copying this over. And I'll remove the copy of from the name, and I'll rename this to test workflow 2. So it's essentially going to be a version 2. All right, so now we have our draft of a workflow that is not applied to any existing projects. So we'll make our changes here, and then we'll go ahead and apply this to our existing projects. So I'll go through the same process and remove all of my transitions. And we'll start adding our custom transitions in. So I'll grab, drag, drop. Give this a name of start work. Now when I click add, we're able to add this transition. I'll do the same thing from in progress to done. And now we have a custom set of transitions inside of this workflow. So what's the purpose of customizing all of your transitions in this way? Well, let's say, for example, that you don't want someone to go from open to done. You want to require the process to go through open, in progress, and then done. So why would we want this versus all transitions to all statuses? So taking this workflow as an example, let's say we don't want to allow open straight to done. What we need to do is define the transitions just like this to make sure that we go from open, in progress, and then done to make sure that in progress is hit prior to closing out this task. And another example is that let's say that this workflow needs to be reopened after something's been moved to done. So I'll add a transition from done back to open, and I'll call this reopen. I'll add the status. I'll add the transition. Now, instead of allowing the status to go from done to in progress, we have to go from done to open to actually reopen this entire workflow. So once we've defined our flow in all of our transitions, we can work on adding validators and conditions. Validators and conditions are extremely powerful within Jira. I'll go over a couple of really common use cases that you'll want to use these for. So to add one of these validators or conditions, all we have to do is click on a status arrow. So not a status itself. If I click on open here, if I click on the actual status of open, I don't have the options that I need. So I'll click on the transition, start work from open to in progress. And now we have a few options here on the right side, including these validators and the conditions. I'll start with validators since that does tend to be more common. And that'll take me to this screen here, which will give you all of the options to add to your status transition. Most common ones that I tend to use are field required validators, parent status validator, permission validator, and previous state validator. You can look into the descriptions to understand a little bit more of what each of these do and how they might be applicable to your workflow. I'll set up a quick example of field required validator. So I'll click on that option, click add. And essentially this just requires a field to be filled out or have some kind of value prior to the transition happening. So I'll choose the assignee field as an example. That way we require an assignee before this task actually moves to in progress. And the error message is going to be very critical here, because if you don't have the message, all you're going to get is a little box that says error, and you want to type out why the error occurred. The user can fix the issue and move on with the rest of the workflow. And the terminology that I tend to use is please enter value for insert field here, in this case assignee. Once we have our field set up and the error message typed out, we can click on add. And now our validator's added. And as you can see, we could actually stack multiple validators within one transition. Going back to a workflow and looking at the original transition that we just modified, if I look at the number right next to the validator field, this shows up as a 1 now to let us know that there is 1 validator currently applied. This is super helpful to help troubleshoot in the future. For example, if there's some errors or some problems with transitions within your workflows, you could jump in here and check if you have any validators in place that might be causing issues. All right, so the second most common thing I would use here are conditions. So I'll click the link here and I'll be brought to a very similar screen as we just saw with validators. And I'll go ahead and add a condition. And here we have a list of items similar to our validators. This list will be a little bit different from validators and give you some different options, more related to users, permissions, and more. And one of the key differences between conditions and validators is that when you have a condition in place, it actually hides the status from showing up as an option. So for example, if we're going from open to in progress and we have a validator set, we'll see that in progress option and we could click on it. But when we do, we get an error message that says, please fill out XYZ. Versus having a condition in place, if we try to transition the workflow, the in progress status will actually just not show up in the first place. So for this example, I'll use the only assignee condition. So maybe I only want an assignee to make this action here. I'll click on add. And that doesn't actually require any other configurations, and it's automatically added to our list of conditions. Going back to our original workflow, we can now see a couple of things that are applied within our options within the status transition. So now for the last and one of the most common use cases for workflows in Jira, approvals. And one thing to note is as of right now, approvals are primarily a JSM feature and not a Jira software feature. There are some team managed project types in Jira that allow this as of right now, and I'm sure that the feature will be available for company managed projects soon. As of today, this is primarily a feature for Jira service management. I'm gonna jump into an existing workflow here to show you how an approval is typically utilized and how to set one up. So this is gonna be for an IT service request. And let's say that a request comes in for a new laptop. Before that request can be fulfilled, we're gonna have to send that through an approval so that the manager or stakeholder can make sure that the request is approved. So the very first status here is the waiting for approval status. If I click on it, I'll get a little checkbox for include approval step. So when you click this, you could click the edit right next to it. And there's going to be a few options that we want to select here. Typically, the number of approvers is just going to be 1. And if you want more than that, you could set that to more than 1. Our approver source is going to be a Jira field. And in this case, it's just an approver field, but it could really be any custom field or system field within Jira. I'll click next. And then we select what happens when a transition is approved versus declined. So if it's approved, it's going to go to the approved status. If it's declined, it's going to go to the declined status. And we're excluding the reporter from approving just in case that the reporter somehow ends up being the approver as well. Once you define your settings and add those in, your approval will be added to the existing workflow. So as we can see here, once we go into the status, once it's approved, it goes straight into waiting for support. That way an agent can see it, start working on and taking action. And if it's declined, the workflow will go into the canceled status and it will be closed out. Hopefully that helps you use Jira workflows better. A couple of things I like to keep in mind are to keep your statuses short, simple, and easy to follow. And same thing goes for your status transitions. Thanks for watching. And if you're interested in how to manage your workflows more effectively, feel free to watch that video next.